So we're now in the Intellij project for the Flights Microservices project, which you can get at the link that will be available or is available in the earlier slides we looked at. And I'll also put this in the website when I post all the videos later. And this is the version that uses Spring WebMVC, Java, parallel streams, and a microservices-based approach using Eureka. And so we're going to first give you an overall view of the way things are structured. And what's interesting is if you were to go back and take a look at the monolithic implementation we looked at a couple of weeks back, you would see that the overall structure of the code is very, very similar. It just is a little bit of the details have been different because we're basically taking all the different packages that used to be objects or classes of which we could make objects and turning them into microservices instead. So let's start off by taking a look at a very high level. So this is in the source part in the server folder. You can see we have flight, exchange, common, airport, and airline. And under airline, we have common, and we have then AA for American Airlines, and we have SWA for Southwest Airlines. Of course, that's just faux examples. I really don't have access to the databases for Southwest or American Airlines, but this will give you a flavor of how things might work in real life. So let's start by just taking a look at the structure of things. What you can see at first glance is all these different packages are done in a very stylized and canonical manner. So everybody here, let's ignore common for a moment, but flight, exchange, airport, and airline all have files that are application files. We have flight application, exchange application, airport application. We have AA, American Airlines application. We have SWA, Southwest Airlines application. So we basically have 5 different applications. And as I talked about earlier when I was talking about this in terms of the overview, the flight portion of this is the so-called app gateway portion. That's the only part that's really visible to clients. And so no surprise, the flight application, as we'll see here shortly, is used to create a flight controller and a backing implementation that's the flight service that provide essentially the app gateway to all the other services. And we'll come back and take a deeper look at that here shortly. It may come as no surprise to you, and of course we will look at this here in just a bit, the flight service, which is what's the implementation of the flight controller, then turns around and makes calls to the other microservices. So for example, one of the things it's going to call under the right circumstances is the exchange microservice. And the exchange microservice is implemented using the exchange application. So it's basically just another server from Spring's point of view that implements the exchange microservice. And as you can see, we've got a controller, and that's what is providing the interface between HTTP requests that are coming in from the flight service into the exchange microservice. And the controller will then turn around and call the exchange service. And the exchange service, in turn, goes and accesses information about exchange rates, which we store in the exchange repository just to make this consistent and fairly straightforward. As I mentioned before, a production version of this would, of course, really talk to an actual concurrency exchange service, so it would know what the latest values were. We look over here at airport. That's another microservice that the flight service will talk to. That has an airport application. As always, it's got an airport controller, which is the public interface that converts between HTTP requests and implementations that are implemented by the airport service. And the airport service turns around and accesses information about known airports that are stored in the airport repository. Again, if you think this is very repetitive and stylized, you are exactly right. That's the whole goal. It's to try to have the principle of least surprise, which is kind of one of those design patterns we talked about earlier about configuration over or convention over configuration. So we're trying to make things have the principle of least surprise. And then last, but by no means least, of the microservice packages is the Airline Microservice. This is the one in some ways that is the most interesting, because what this does is this is what provides access to the actual flight leg databases for different airlines. So we have American Airlines, Southwest Airlines, they actually share a common they share some common code in the form of a controller, in the form of a service, and in the form of a repository. And then through the magic of properties that, of course, are specified declaratively, they're able to reuse that code and tweak it just ever so slightly in order to be able to get the information in a format that corresponds to what American flights there are, what Southwest flights there are, and so on. And of course, we have full control over this. And you might think, well, gosh, isn't that a little bit contrived? But of course, it turns out in practice, we could just write adapters and take whatever format these services came in and be able to access them using a common proxy facade, if you will. So there's all kinds of ways to make something like this really work in practice. And in fact, I would strongly recommend trying to do that as much as possible using the magic of product line architectures and commonality and variability analysis. So these are by no means pedantic ivory tower ways of looking at the world. This is really the way people tend to build these kinds of systems in practice if they spend much time thinking about what they're doing. Okay, so that's kind of the high level view. Now, if we take a look down here, we see we have a resources folder, and in there are the resources files that specify properties and schemas and data for all the different microservices and, of course, the main app gateway. So we'll take a look at all those things in more detail, but these are basically how we, again, sort of declaratively specify the properties and glue them all together using the pattern of convention over configuration that I talked about before. And then the final thing we have here at a high level are the tests. So we have a whole bunch of tests, and these tests will exercise the different features that are provided by the various microservices and the app gateway. And as we get into the code a little bit more, I'll kind of walk through some of this stuff in more detail. But just for kicks, just to give us something concrete to do, let's assume for sake of argument that we have actually taken the time to look at all this code, and now we want to make sure it works. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and run the tests, and hopefully everything will work. So we run the tests. It goes ahead and instantiates the tests. And as I mentioned before, all these tests are going to run. It'll compile the project, and then all the tests will run, and they'll exercise all the various endpoints that are exposed by the different microservices. We have tests here that start out and go through the controller, make sure that that works. We have tests here that go ahead and go through the services and make sure they all work, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of see we have, I think, something around 25 to 30 tests when all is said and done. And lo and behold, they all work. So this gives us a good, nice, warm, fuzzy feeling that the code we're going to look at here shortly actually does the right thing.